On Friday, June 16th, the sky over Oakland, California broke open in a torrential downpour. Heavy, cold drops beat a dreary, monotonous rhythm on the rusted tin roofs of the low-income apartment complex on Willow Street, turning the cracked pavement into a street. Inside the old two-story building, where the yellowed paint was peeling in large flakes and the air perpetually carried a scent of must, Mrs. Coleman, an elderly white woman living on the first floor, felt a vague sense of unease. Over 20 years in the same apartment had taught her the building's every sound, a familiar symphony. The hurried footsteps of the young man on the third floor, leaving for his night shift, the muffled drone of the old man's television across the hall, the cries of the Johnsons' new baby. But this morning, one of the most familiar and loudest sounds was missing. That silence was a discordant note, jarring and alarming. It was the silence from apartment number 6, upstairs. It was the silence of Abby Dixon. Abby, a 19-year-old African-American girl, was a whirlwind of energy. She was the embodiment of youth, of a fierce vitality. Every morning at 7 a.m. sharp, the entire building would vibrate with the thud of her feet on the wooden staircase. Not walking, but dancing, as if each new day were an adventure. It was immediately followed by the driving bass of hip-hop, turned up to full volume, a sound that challenged the world, a declaration of, "I am here," serving as an unwilling alarm clock for everyone. But today, the old grandfather clock in Mrs. Coleman's living room had struck 7:30, then 7:45, and only a deadening silence answered. The quiet was heavy and unnatural. It swallowed all other sounds, even the drumming of the rain. Mrs. Coleman frowned, the wrinkles on her forehead deepening. Abby was always late for her classes. That was normal. But she was never silent like this. She picked up her old landline phone, its plastic casing yellowed with age, and dialed Abby's number for the third time that morning. Still, only the hopeless, monotonous ringing of a phone unanswered, echoing like a taunt. A chill crept into the old woman's heart, starting at the base of her spine and spreading through her body. She knew Abby was supposed to go to her aunt and uncle's for dinner last night, an event the girl hadn't seemed particularly excited about. But something, an old woman's intuition honed by decades of observing life, told her that something was deeply wrong. This wasn't the silence of a peaceful sleep. It was the silence of something that had ended. Deciding she had to check for herself, Mrs. Coleman steadied herself on the banister and slowly climbed the creaking wooden stairs. Each step felt heavier than the last. The stagnant air on the second floor, a mixture of old dust, cheap cigarette smoke, and the dampness of the storm made her uneasy. She stood before apartment number 6, its mint green door peeling, took a deep breath, and knocked lightly. "Abby, dear?" Her voice sounded lost in the empty hallway. Silence. She knocked again, harder this time, her old knuckles rapping urgently against the wood. Still, only the sound of the rain against the window answered. It was then that Mrs. Coleman noticed it. The door wasn't fully latched. It was ajar by a sliver, just a few centimeters. But it was enough for a cold draft to seep out, carrying a strange, cloying odor, sweetly acrid with a metallic undertone. The smell of something broken. A real, tangible fear seized her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, so loud she could hear it in her ears. She pushed the door gently, her voice trembling. "Abby, are you home?" The scene inside made her freeze, her old blue eyes widening in horror. The small, surprisingly tidy living room was now a tableau of violence. A pine coffee table was flipped upside down, its legs pointing to the ceiling like a silent plea. A ceramic vase was shattered, its sharp shards and murky water strewn across the cheap rug, mingled with the crushed petals of daisies. Books were scattered everywhere, as if someone had torn them from the shelf in a fit of rage. This wasn't the mess of a young woman. This was the aftermath of a violent, desperate struggle. Mrs. Coleman took another step, her legs trembling on the cold floor, and then froze solid, her breath caught in her throat. Peeking out from behind the displaced sofa was a hand, a small, still woman's hand. And on the fingers, a coat of bright red nail polish, vibrant as drops of blood, stood out in gruesome relief against the dark rug. It was the same shade Abby had shown her just 2 days ago, saying it made her feel powerful. Now, that power was gone, replaced by a terrifying stillness. Mrs. Coleman's scream tore through the morning silence, a shriek of raw fear and loss that woke the entire building and set in motion a haunting investigation that would unearth a family's darkest secrets. 45 minutes later, the silence in apartment number 6 was gone, replaced by a controlled chaos. The blinking strobes of crime scene photographers' flashes lit the room in stark, artificial bursts, freezing every gruesome detail. The air was thick with the scent of tragedy mixed with the chemical smell of the forensics team, an odor Detective Lucia Parker knew all too well. Lucia, a formidable African-American woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and her hair in neat cornrows, was crouched beside the victim's body. 8 years in the Oakland PD's homicide division had forged an almost unbreakable composure, a necessary armor to confront the darkest aspects of humanity. But that armor was never thick enough to stop the pang of grief she felt, seeing a young life so brutally extinguished. The victim, Abby Dixon, lay supine on the damp rug, her dark brown eyes wide open, filled with a tragic look of disbelief, as if she couldn't comprehend what was happening until the very last moment. Bruises shaped like fingertips marred the skin on her neck, the sign of a violent strangulation, an attempt to silence her. But that wasn't what had killed her. A deep, gaping stab wound in the center of her chest had soaked her white t-shirt a dark, terrible crimson. The wound looked chillingly precise. "Time of death?" Lucia asked, her voice steady, forcing a professional distance from the tragedy before her. "Based on lividity and body temp, I'd estimate between 9 and 11 p.m. last night." The medical examiner, Martin Chen, a thin man in glasses, replied. "Cause of death was a single stab wound to the chest. The blade went between the ribs, straight through the heart. Clean and fatal. Looks like the attacker knew what they were doing, or got incredibly lucky. No defensive wounds on her hands, which suggests she was either restrained or taken completely by surprise." Lucia slowly rose to her feet, her eyes scanning the room again, absorbing every detail. 19 years old. This girl hadn't even really started to live. Framed photos hung on the wall, fragments of a life cut short. Abby beaming with friends on high school graduation day. Abby looking glamorous in a sea blue prom dress. Abby, much younger, standing between a middle-aged man and woman, presumably her aunt and uncle, in front of a lovely house. A picture-perfect family, but Lucia knew pictures always lied. They captured a single moment, not the whole story. "No sign of forced entry, Detective," a young officer, Tyrone Gaines, reported as he entered the room. Gaines was Lucia's new partner, a tall African-American man who'd been in homicide for only 3 weeks, still full of idealism and a drive to prove himself in an environment where he felt his skin color was a silent prejudice he had to overcome. He looked at Lucia with unconcealed admiration. Neighbors didn't hear anything over the storm. Looks like she knew her killer. More likely she let him in herself, Lucia corrected, a faint wry smile touching her lips. "Let's not jump to conclusions, Officer Gaines," she said, her tone a mix of instruction and challenge. "Let's stick to the facts, and the facts suggest the victim let her killer into the apartment, a struggle ensued, and the attacker used a knife from her own kitchen." She pointed to a stainless steel kitchen knife lying on the floor near the body. Its blade was still coated in a dark, sticky substance. "Check the handle for prints." Tyrone nodded and stepped back, his face a mask of concentration. Lucia continued her search. Abby's purse was on the table. Inside, she found $37 in loose bills, a student ID for Laney Community College, a tube of nude pink lipstick, a set of keys, and a smartphone with a cracked screen. "Doesn't look like a robbery," Lucia muttered. She powered on the phone, fortunate to find it had no password. The text messages were unremarkable, just typical conversations with friends about homework and weekend plans. The call log showed the same, with the last call made at 6 p.m. the previous evening from a contact labeled Aunt Sheila. The call had lasted only 37 seconds, but just as Lucia was about to place the phone in an evidence bag, Tyrone called out to her, his voice edged with excitement. "Detective Parker, look at this." He was pointing to a small entryway table where people usually toss their mail. On the table was a stack of envelopes, utility bills, pizza flyers, but sandwiched between them was something different, a thick, white envelope. No stamp, no return address, just the name Abby written in neat, black ink. Lucia carefully put on a fresh pair of gloves and picked it up with a pair of tweezers. It felt heavy. She carefully opened it. Inside, there was no letter, only cash, 5 crisp new $100 bills. A total of $500. No explanation. A part-time waitress, a community college student, was getting mysterious cash deliveries to her door. This case had just become far more complex. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was something planned, something secret, something that involved money. Lucia looked back at Abby's body. The girl's life, it was clear, was not as simple as it appeared. An hour later, Lucia and Tyrone began the tedious but necessary process of interviewing the neighbors, knocking on the doors of the small apartment building. The air in the hallway was thick with the smell of damp rain and fear, a palpable, invisible film. The residents opened their doors hesitantly, their eyes filled with a mixture of morbid curiosity and apprehension at the sight of the police badges. They started with Mrs. Coleman, who was still shaken, being comforted by a paramedic with a cup of hot tea in her small, tidy apartment. Abby was a good girl, Mrs. Coleman repeated, her voice still trembling, as if trying to convince herself. But private? To be honest, for a young black girl living on her own, she was doing pretty well for herself. I always wondered where the money came from. She took a sip of tea, her eyes gazing out the window, where the rain still streaked down the glass. She wasn't like the other kids in this neighborhood. There was always something different about her, like she didn't belong here, or was trying hard not to. She paused. Sometimes I'd see fancy cars, the kind you never see around here, parked down the street late at night. They'd just sit there for a while, then drive off. I never saw anyone get out, but it was strange. Mrs. Coleman's words, though tinged with a bit of neighborhood gossip and prejudice, planted a seed of valid suspicion in Lucia's mind. "Fancy cars?" she asked. "Can you be more specific?" "Oh no, dear," she said, shaking her head. "My eyes are terrible, especially at night. I just know they were expensive, shiny, and not the kind of cars working folks drive." Lucia made a note. It fit with the $500 in cash. A wealthy patron? She moved on to Lakesha Johnson, the young woman in the apartment across the hall. "Abby was great," Lakesha said, cradling a sleeping newborn in her arms. Her apartment was cluttered with children's toys, but had a warmth that contrasted sharply with the coldness outside. "She'd watch my kids for me sometimes when I had to work the night shift. The kids loved her." Lakesha paused, frowning in thought as she gently rocked her baby. "She told me she was about to have enough money to move to a better neighborhood. She was so sure of it, so confident. She even showed me pictures of some apartments in Rockridge on her phone. Those places are expensive." "Did she seem happy?" Tyrone asked. "Happy and nervous," Lakesha replied, like a person on the verge of a big life change. But, oh, there was something else. About a week ago, I was taking out the trash and I saw her arguing with some guy in the lobby. A white guy, blonde hair, looked kinda rough. He was leaning into her space, real aggressive. I didn't catch it all, but I heard him yell, "You think you can just play me? And you're gonna regret this." Abby looked terrified. She just said, "Leave me alone," and ran upstairs. I was going to ask if she was okay, but she slammed her door shut. A new, more concrete suspect had emerged. "Did you get a good look at his face?" Tyrone asked, his notebook already open. Lakesha shook her head. "Just a glance, under that dim yellow light in the hall. But he drove an old blue Ford pickup truck, a real beater. The front right fender was dented like it had been in a wreck." Lucia recorded the details: a white man, a financial dispute, a distinctive vehicle. This could be an entirely different angle. Perhaps the mystery money wasn't from a patron, but from some shady business deal gone wrong. She and Tyrone continued their canvass, and another neighbor, a grumpy old man named Henderson on the first floor, confirmed seeing the blue pickup truck lurking around the building several times over the past week. "Trash!" he grumbled through the crack in his chain door. "Always circling around here, probably looking for something to steal. I was about to call the cops myself." The case was no longer just about the family. It had just branched into a new line of inquiry, one that felt more violent and unpredictable. Their next stop was still the Dixon residence in Piedmont, a neighborhood that was a world away. But now they were armed with more questions and a deeper skepticism about the true nature of Abby Dixon's life, a girl who seemed to exist in two completely opposite worlds. The drive from Willow Street to Piedmont was like passing through an invisible portal into another dimension. The pockmarked roads were replaced with smooth asphalt. The dilapidated apartment buildings gave way to large, manicured houses with lush green lawns and pristine white fences. The home of the Dixon family, a successful African-American couple, was a classic, well-maintained craftsman, exuding an aura of carefully calculated peace. Lucia knew neighborhoods like this, where black families had to work twice as hard to fit in and maintain a flawless image, and sometimes that pressure created cracks that weren't visible from the outside. The heavy oak door was opened by Sheila Dixon. She was an elegant woman, dressed in an expensive-looking silk lounge set, but her face was etched with a fatigue that no amount of money could hide. She offered a practiced, polite smile, which vanished the instant she saw Lucia's police badge. "Mrs. Sheila Dixon," Lucia asked, her tone formal. "We're with the Oakland Police Department. May we come in?" Sheila stepped back silently, a gesture of reluctant invitation. The interior was luxurious, with gleaming hardwood floors, modern furniture, and tasteful art by prominent black artists on the walls. It was a stark contrast to Abby's cramped apartment. In the living room, Hammond Dixon, a large, powerfully built man, was seated on a leather sofa watching television. He looked up, his expression annoyed at the intrusion. "Hammond, it's the police," Sheila said softly, her voice barely a whisper. Lucia delivered the terrible news. She watched their reactions closely, searching for the slightest tell. The couple's response was bizarre. Sheila didn't scream or cry. She simply froze, her eyes widening, her hands slowly rising to her throat, as if she couldn't breathe. Hammond shot to his feet, his voice trembling, but his eyes held a strange panic as he darted a look at his wife, as if searching for a cue. "What? No, that's not possible," Hammond stammered. How? "We believe it happened last night, sir," Lucia said, keeping her voice calm. "We were told Abby was on her way here for dinner, for your anniversary." "Yes, she was supposed to come," Sheila said, her voice eerily flat, devoid of any emotion. "But she never showed up. We called her, but she didn't answer. We figured she changed her mind. She does that sometimes." The explanation was too simple, too cold. A niece misses a 20th anniversary dinner, doesn't answer her phone, and they simply figured she changed her mind. Did she have any enemies? Was she having problems with anyone? Lucia pressed, changing tactics. Hammond was quick to shake his head. "No, nothing like that. She was a good girl, just focused on her schoolwork." "What about a boyfriend?" Tyrone interjected, his voice firm. "Was she having trouble with a boyfriend? We have information that she was recently in an argument with a young man." Another lightning-fast glance passed between the couple. This time, Hammond spoke, as if on cue, his relief at having someone to blame almost palpable. There was a boy, Jake, I think his name was. They dated briefly when Abby first moved out, but she broke up with him, said he was lazy, no ambition. He would call and bother her sometimes, wanting to get back together. He was quite aggressive. It was probably him. Yes, I'm sure it had something to do with him. The name Jake clicked into place for Lucia. It matched the neighbor's story. But the way Hammond so quickly threw Jake under the bus, emphasizing his aggression, made Lucia even more suspicious. It felt like the Dixons were all too willing to point the finger at an outsider. Were they cooperating, or were they simply scared and looking for an easy explanation for the tragedy? "May we see Abby's room from when she lived here?" Lucia asked. Sheila hesitated for a moment, then nodded, leading them upstairs. The room was preserved, clean to the point of being sterile, more like a museum exhibit than a teenager's bedroom. Everything was pink and white, innocent and childish. But on the desk, Lucia noticed a deep scratch on the wood, as if someone had carved into it with a sharp object. She left the house with a growing sense of unease. The perfect exterior of this family, this house, only made the secrets within feel all the more terrifying. Back at the Oakland PD headquarters, a grim, soulless concrete building, Lucia and Tyrone walked into the morning briefing. Their captain, a nearing retirement white man named Miller, with silver hair and a prominent gut, was impatient. He wanted simple cases and quick answers to peacefully round out his career. "An argument with an ex-boyfriend in a slum? Sounds open and shut," Miller said, glancing over Tyrone's report. "The victim is a black girl living in a rough neighborhood, involved with a white kid with a record. This is a script we see every week. Focus on the kid, Parker. We need to close this one fast. The press is already sniffing around. Lucia felt a familiar irritation rise within her. Miller's easy willingness to frame the case within a racial and class-based stereotype was infuriating. Captain, the victim's family is acting suspiciously. Their statements are contradictory. Miller waved a dismissive hand. They just lost a family member, Parker. Of course they're in shock. They're a respectable family from Piedmont. They have nothing to do with this. Don't overcomplicate things. Find the kid, Jake. That's an order. Lucia clenched her jaw. She knew arguing further was pointless. She had to follow the order. She assigned Tyrone and a patrol unit to track down the blue Ford pickup and its owner, Jake Peterson. Meanwhile, she decided to pursue a different path on her own, one guided by her intuition. She drove back to Abby's apartment alone. She needed the space, the silence to think, without the influence of others' preconceived notions. She stood in the middle of the chaotic room where the forensics team had finished their work, leaving behind smudges of gray fingerprint powder on various surfaces. She tried to reconstruct what had happened: the argument, the fear, the struggle. Her gaze fell on the toppled bookshelf. Most of the books were textbooks, but there were a few cheap romance novels. Behind them, she spotted something the initial sweep had missed because it didn't look like evidence. A small, worn, pink leather-bound diary, wedged beneath the base of the sofa. Lucia's heart beat faster. She carefully put on gloves, retrieved it, and sat on the front step of the apartment, the hallway behind her quiet and empty. She opened it page by page. The diary was filled with Abby's neat, slightly childish handwriting. Most of it was the typical musings of a teenage girl: troubles at school, crushes on boys, arguments with friends. But as she got closer to the present day, the tone grew darker, the handwriting more frantic, as if written in haste or anger. Lucia turned to the final entries. June 1st. I can't take it anymore. The way he looks at me makes my skin crawl. The way he calls me his little girl, it makes me want to throw up. His hand on my shoulder, lingering for too long. Sheila doesn't see it. She's too good, too trusting, too blind. I have to get out of here. I need money, a lot of it. I can't live like this forever. June 8th. Jake found me again. He's such an idiot. He thinks I owe him. He's the one who messed everything up. I had to clean up the mess myself, but I'm scared. The look in his eyes, it was full of hate. He called me a snake, a backstabber. Maybe he's right. June 14th. Tomorrow is the anniversary. I have to go. He said it's the last chance to talk. He left the money in the usual place, but it's not enough. I'm going to ask for it all at once. $5,000. Enough to disappear and start over. If he says no, I'm telling Sheila everything. Everything since that night at the ballet recital when I was 15. The night he ruined everything. Lucia closed the diary, her heart pounding. There it was. The full picture was beginning to emerge. Evidence of a toxic relationship with Hammond. A palpable fear of Jake, and a desperate plan to blackmail someone on the very night she was murdered. The case wasn't one path or the other. It was a horrific intersection of both. The victim wasn't an innocent angel. She was a survivor, fighting to break free. Just then her phone buzzed. It was Tyrone. Detective, we found Jake Peterson. He's at a dive bar in West Oakland. The dented pickup is parked right outside. Don't move in. Maintain visual, Lucia commanded, her voice now hard as steel. I'm on my way. While Tyrone and his team staked out Jake Peterson, Lucia decided to make a call. The image of the ballet recital from Abby's diary was stuck in her mind. She found the number for Lillian Dubois, Abby's former ballet instructor, a name mentioned in an old newspaper article about the city's young talents. Mrs. Dubois, an elderly woman with a dancer's posture and a clear, resonant voice, agreed to meet Lucia at a quiet little cafe. Abigail, Mrs. Dubois said, stirring her chamomile tea, her eyes distant with memory. A natural talent. I've been teaching for 40 years, and I've only seen a few children with her kind of fire. She didn't just dance, she told stories with her body. She had a grace and emotion that takes others years to develop. I thought she was going to be a star, that she would dance her way out of whatever life she came from. Why did she quit, ma'am? Lucia asked, sensing the sadness in the old teacher's voice. Mrs. Dubois sighed, the lines on her forehead deepening. It was one of the greatest regrets of my career. Everything changed after the big performance when she was 15. She danced the lead in the Nutcracker. She was flawless. The audience gave her a standing ovation. But after that night, she never came back to class. She hesitated, then looked Lucia straight in the eye, as if deciding to finally share a burden she had carried for years. I called her aunt, Mrs. Dixon. She just said that Abby had decided she wasn't interested anymore, that she wanted to focus on her studies. But I didn't believe it. A child doesn't give up on their passion like that, not when they're at the very top of their game. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. I always felt something was wrong. Her uncle, Hammond. He came to every practice, every performance. At first, I thought it was wonderful, supportive, but the way he looked at her, it wasn't right. It was possessive, an unhealthy adoration. His gaze would linger on her body for too long. Sometimes, after practice, he'd bring her water and massage her shoulders. She always looked so uncomfortable. And the night of the performance? Lucia pressed. That night, Mrs. Dubois said, her voice turning icy. After the curtain fell, I went backstage to congratulate Abby. I found him there, in her private dressing room. They were arguing. I couldn't hear everything, but he was holding her arm tightly and saying something like, "You're mine, and you can't let anyone else have you." Abby was crying, trying to pull her arm away. When they saw me, they fell silent. He let go of her and smiled at me, saying he was just so proud of his little girl. But I saw Abby's eyes. Those weren't tears of joy. They were tears of fear and disgust. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. A traumatic event had happened at 15, one significant enough to extinguish Abby's passion and likely set the stage for the tragedy to come. Hammond wasn't just a loving uncle. He was a predator. Lucia thanked Mrs. Dubois and left quickly. She needed to get to Jake Peterson. She needed to understand what his role was in this tangled, sordid story. The rusty anchor bar was tucked away in a forgotten corner of West Oakland, a place where daylight seemed afraid to enter. The smell of stale beer, old smoke, and quiet desperation hung heavy in the air. As Lucia walked in, every head turned, a sudden silence falling over the noisy space. Tyrone was waiting in a corner, giving her a subtle nod towards the bar. There, hunched over, was Jake Peterson, nursing his third beer. He was exactly as described. Shaggy blonde hair, listless blue eyes, and an air of defiant resignation on his scruffy face. His t-shirt was grimy, and his arms were covered in faded, cheap tattoos. "Jake Peterson?" Lucia said, her voice cool and authoritative, cutting through the silence. Jake looked up, squinting at her badge. He let out a humorless, sneering laugh. "Finally caught up to me. I was wondering when you'd show." "We need to ask you a few questions about Abby Dixon," Tyrone said, positioning himself to block Jake's exit. "Abby," Jake repeated the name, his voice dripping with bitterness. "That bitch. I heard something happened to her. Serves her right." "You don't sound too broken up about it," Lucia observed, watching his reaction like a hawk. "Broken up? Why should I be?" Jake slammed his glass on the bar. "She played me. She took my money. We had a deal, and she stabbed me in the back. She thought she was smarter than me, but she was just a naive kid playing grown-up games." "What kind of deal?" Lucia pressed. Jake hesitated, licking his dry lips. "Just business. None of your concern. I helped her with a problem, and she promised me a cut. But then she ghosted me, wouldn't answer my calls. So, yeah, I went to see her. I told her she'd regret it if she didn't give me my money. But I didn't kill her," he yelled, drawing stares from the few other patrons. "Where were you on Thursday night? Between 9 and 11 p.m.? Tyrone asked, his voice a steady monotone. "Right here," Jake gestured around the bar. "On this very stool. I was drinking until I couldn't stand up straight. Ask the bartender. Ask anyone here. I was here all night," cursing Abby Dixon's name. Lucia looked at the bartender, a tired, middle-aged man who looked like he'd seen it all. He gave a weary nod. "That's right, detective. The kid was here. He was loud and drinking hard. I almost had to call the cops to get him to leave at closing time." Jake's alibi seemed solid. He had a motive, but no opportunity. Lucia and Tyrone took him back to the station for a formal statement and fingerprints. In the sterile environment of the interrogation room, Jake became slightly more cooperative. "Look," he said, leaning forward, "I'm no saint, but But I'm not a killer. Abby, she changed. When we first met, she was sweet, kind of sad. But then she started getting this money from somewhere. She got secretive, jumpy. She talked about getting away, starting over. She talked about getting revenge on someone who hurt her a long time ago. Who? Lucia asked. Jake shook his head. She never said a name, just called him the demon in her family. I thought she was being dramatic. I never thought it would come to this. Leaving the interrogation room, Lucia felt a sense of frustrated clarity. Jake wasn't their killer, but he had corroborated what she'd read in Abby's diary. The demon in her family. She now knew exactly who she needed to target. She looked at Tyrone. We're going back to the Dixon house, but this time, we need more than just questions. She picked up her phone. I need the technical analysis and the financial reports on the Dixon family. Now. While waiting for the financial reports, Lucia and Tyrone revisited the Golden Lily jewelry store. This time, they came with more specific questions. Besides the cufflinks, did the young woman purchase anything else? Lucia asked the elderly saleswoman. She thought for a moment, then nodded. Oh yes, about a month ago, she came in to have a necklace repaired. An old silver necklace with a little ballerina charm. It was very delicate, but the chain was broken. Do you remember if there was an inscription? I do, she said. On the back of the charm, it was engraved, To my little dancer, forever, H. H for Hammond, forever. The promise of a predator. A chill went down Lucia's spine. Abby was trying to repair a memento from the very person who had hurt her. Why? Was it an attachment, a reminder, or something else entirely? They drove back to Piedmont, the air inside the car heavy with unspoken thoughts. As they approached the Dixon house, Lucia saw that Hammond's car was not in the driveway. The door was opened by Sheila, who looked even more exhausted and frail than the day before. Her eyes were puffy and red. Hammond is not here. He's at work, Sheila said, her voice hoarse. Good, Lucia said. We wanted to speak with you alone. Lucia began her questioning, slowly presenting the new information, like a chess player moving pieces into place. Sheila stuck to her story mechanically, insisting she was at church and that Abby never arrived. But when Lucia mentioned the ballerina necklace, she saw a flicker in Sheila's eyes, a flash of recognition followed by a wave of pain. I don't know anything about a necklace, Sheila lied, but her voice had lost its conviction. Lucia knew that words alone wouldn't break her. She needed undeniable physical evidence. The cufflinks. They had to be somewhere on the property. Her gaze drifted out the living room window to the meticulously manicured garden. An idea sparked in her mind. If Sheila had found the gift, in a fit of rage and panic, she might have thrown it away. Tyrone, Lucia said quietly into her radio, get a K-9 unit out here. I want to search for evidentiary items. Get a warrant for the entire property, house, and grounds, effective immediately. Half an hour later, a K-9 unit vehicle pulled up in front of the Dixon house. The handler let out a large, majestic German shepherd named Shadow. Sheila stood by the window, watching in horror as police began to section off her perfect garden, her perfect world being invaded. Lucia gave Shadow one of Abby's items, a scarf from her apartment, to get the scent. Fine, Shadow, the handler commanded. The dog began to search systematically, its nose hovering just above the ground. It moved along the fence, past the rose bushes. Several tense minutes passed in silence, broken only by the rustling of leaves. Suddenly, Shadow stopped near a thick azalea bush in the corner of the yard. It began to bark and scratch at the soft, damp earth. The handler rushed over, using a small trowel to dig. And there, glinting in the dirt, was a small metal object.
It was a pair of silver cufflinks. Engraved on them were the clear initials, HD 615. But Shadow wasn't finished. It continued to sniff nearby, then began barking more insistently toward a wooden compost bin at the back of the garden. The handler opened the lid. Beneath a layer of decomposing leaves and grass clippings was a silk scarf, a vibrant emerald green, stained with mud. Lucia recognized it instantly. It was the scarf Sheila was wearing in the family portrait on the wall. And on the scarf, there was a small tear, along with several dark stains that looked unmistakably like blood. The undeniable physical evidence had been found. The game was over.
Lucia walked back into the living room holding two evidence bags, one containing the cufflinks, the other the silk scarf. She placed them decisively on the glass coffee table. The sound echoed in the silent room. Sheila Dixon sat on the sofa, her face a pale, bloodless mask. She stared at the green scarf, and her shoulders began to shake. The cold, composed facade she had maintained for 2 days finally shattered into a million pieces. "Mrs. Dixon," Lucia began, her voice calm but firm. "We found these in your garden." Sheila said nothing, just shook her head in a small, involuntary gesture, as if trying to deny the reality laid out before her. "You were at Abby's apartment on the night she was killed," Lucia continued, leaving no room for denial. "You were wearing this scarf. There was a struggle. A piece of fabric from this scarf was found at the scene, caught under Abby's fingernails. We also have cell tower data that places you there." "Hey, Sheila," Lucia said, her tone softening, shifting from a detective to a woman. "We know what happened. You found out about Hammond and Abby. Maybe you found the messages on his phone, or maybe you'd known for a long time, and that day was simply the breaking point. You went to Abby's to confront her." I didn't mean to," Sheila whispered, her voice breaking. They were the first honest words she had spoken, a confession, simple and tragic. "Tell us what happened, Sheila," Lucia said, sitting in the chair opposite her, creating a safe space for the confession to unfold. Sheila took a deep, shuddering breath and began her story. Her voice was flat, almost detached, as if she were recounting a nightmare she had been forced to relive 100 times in her mind. "It was our 20th anniversary. 20 years, she repeated, the words sounding hollow and meaningless. "I had been preparing all day. I cleaned the house, I cooked his favorite meal, brisket, I bought a new dress. I wanted the evening to be special. I was going to surprise him. I even ordered a cake with our names and a picture from our wedding on it." She paused, gathering her strength. "Hammond went to take a shower, and he left his phone on the kitchen counter. It buzzed. A message from Abby. "Can't wait to see you today. I have something I need to tell you. Love you?" I knew his password. We never kept secrets from each other, or so I thought. I opened their conversation and I read everything. All of his promises, all of her demands for money, all of their plans. Her voice trembled. I couldn't believe it. My husband and my niece. The little girl I had raised for my brother since she was 12. I didn't know what to do. When Hammond came out of the shower, I pretended like nothing had happened. I said I was going to church, like I always do on Fridays. But instead, I drove to her apartment. I just wanted to talk. I wanted to ask her why. I raised her like my own daughter. I gave her everything. She didn't deny it, Sheila continued, tears now streaming down her tired face. She laughed in my face, a defiant laugh. She said Hammond never really loved me, that he was with her because I couldn't give him what he needed. And then, she said she was leaving with him, that they had been planning it for months, that he had promised to leave me and start a new life with her in another city. At that moment, I just snapped. Everything went red. I slapped her. She pushed me. We started struggling. My scarf was torn. She screamed at me that I was a pathetic old woman. I don't remember grabbing the knife. It was just there, on the kitchen counter, gleaming under the light. And then she fell. Sheila buried her face in her hands, her body racked with sobs. I didn't mean to kill her. I swear to God, I didn't mean to. It just happened. I just wanted her to be quiet. The confession was out, a tragedy born from betrayal, and finished with an act that could never be undone. A heavy silence descended upon the luxurious living room of the Dixon home, a silence now tainted by the horrifying truth. Sheila's confession hung in the air, an irreversible fact that had demolished everything she had ever built. Lucia looked at the broken woman before her and couldn't help but feel a pang of empathy. This wasn't a cold-blooded monster. This was a woman pushed to the brink by a dual betrayal from the two people she loved most in the world. But justice, however complicated, still had to be served. "Sheila Dixon," Lucia said, her voice regaining its professional formality, though her heart felt heavy. She stood up. "You are under arrest for the murder of Abby Dixon. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." Tyrone, who had stood silently throughout the confession, moved forward and handcuffed Sheila. She offered no resistance, her body limp with surrender. In fact, in her tear-filled eyes, there was a strange sense of relief, as if the confession had finally freed her from a terrible burden she had been carrying alone. As they led her to the waiting patrol car, Sheila stopped and turned to Lucia. "May I ask one thing?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "Don't tell Hammond I was here. Let him find out at the station. I don't want to see his face when he learns what I did to his Abby." The way she emphasized the words "his Abby" was filled with a final, bitter irony. "Okay," Lucia nodded. It was a small mercy she could grant. At the station, in a cold, sterile interrogation room, Sheila repeated her confession formally, leaving out no detail. Afterward, she was taken to a holding cell. Lucia dispatched an officer to Hammond Dixon's auto body shop, a place where he worked on classic cars, a world of grease and steel so far removed from the polished perfection of his home. Hammond arrived at the precinct half an hour later, looking confused and slightly annoyed. "Detective Parker, the officer said you wanted to see me. Did something happen to Sheila? She's not answering her phone." "Please sit down, Mr. Dixon," Lucia said, gesturing to a cold metal chair in her office. Hammond sat, his large hands resting on his knees, still carrying the air of a man accustomed to being in charge. "Your wife has been arrested on suspicion of Abby Dixon's murder," Lucia said bluntly with no preamble. "She has confessed to the crime." Hammond froze, the confident facade on his face shattered like glass. "What? No, that's impossible. Sheila would never. She loved Abby. She wouldn't hurt a fly." "She found out about your relationship with Abby," Lucia continued, her voice as cold as ice. "She found the messages on your phone, on your anniversary. She went to Abby's to talk, but the conversation turned into an argument, and then a physical altercation." Hammond buried his face in his hands, his large body convulsing. Muffled, choked sobs began to escape. "Oh my God, this is my fault. It's all my fault." "Yes," Lucia agreed, her voice devoid of sympathy. "For the most part, it is." Hammond looked up, his face now a mask of anguish and remorse, streaked with tears. "I never wanted any of this to happen. I loved them both, in different ways, but I loved them." "Love isn't supposed to destroy, Mr. Dixon," Lucia said quietly, her words like a scalpel. "Real love builds and protects. What you did wasn't love. It was selfishness. And it has destroyed 3 lives." "Can I see her?" Hammond asked, his voice desperate. "Sheila?" "She doesn't want to see you," Lucia replied. "At least, not right now. Give her time." The weight of guilt had now fully transferred to Hammond. He was not the killer, but his actions had lit the fuse that detonated his entire family. He would have to live with that for the rest of his life. A week later, the preliminary hearing took place. The district attorney's office charged Sheila Dixon with voluntary manslaughter rather than first-degree murder, acknowledging the evidence of extreme emotional disturbance and lack of premeditation. Her lawyer, an expensive attorney hired by Hammond, argued passionately about the mitigating circumstances. A crime of passion spurred by an unimaginable betrayal, a clean record, and profound remorse demonstrated by her immediate confession. Hammond attended every court session, a ghost of his former self, sitting in the back row. He never dared to look up. Sheila, at the defendant's table, never once looked in his direction. To her, he no longer existed. Lucia was also present for the final sentencing. It was a part of the job she never enjoyed, but she felt a responsibility to be there, to see the story to its end. Standing before the judge, Sheila looked small and frail in her orange prison jumpsuit, a stark contrast to the elegant woman Lucia had first met. "Mrs. Dixon," the judge said, his voice solemn, "you have pleaded guilty to the voluntary manslaughter of Abby Dixon. This court recognizes the unique circumstances of this case and your heartfelt confession. Nevertheless, a young life was taken, and that warrants a significant punishment. This court sentences you to 8 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after 5. Sheila simply nodded, accepting the sentence as an inevitability, a penance she must pay. As she was led out of the courtroom, she looked at Hammond for the first time. Their eyes met for a single, fleeting second, a moment filled with pain, regret, and a vast, empty void. And then she looked away, disappearing behind the door, leaving him alone in the wreckage. Leaving the courthouse, Lucia ran into Hammond in the hallway. "Detective Parker?" He stopped her, his voice weak. "I wanted to thank you. for finding the truth. I was just doing my job, Mr. Dixon, Lucia replied, maintaining a professional distance. Have you visited her? Hammond asked suddenly. Sheila, she won't see me. She won't answer my letters. Once, Lucia nodded. She's holding on. She said she's finding peace in prayer and the prison ministry. Hammond gave a sad smile. That's her, always stronger than me. I sold the house. The money will go to her lawyers and to an account for her to use when she gets out. I'm leaving town. Where to? I don't know. Somewhere no one knows me. Somewhere I can start over. But Lucia knew he could never really start over. The past would always be his shadow. That evening, Lucia sat on her front porch, watching her 12-year-old son play in the yard with the neighborhood kids. Their innocent laughter filled the cool evening air. It was a normal, peaceful scene, a world away from the dark, twisted crimes she confronted every day. She thought of Sheila, now sitting in a prison cell, of Hammond driving off into the unknown with the weight of his guilt, of Abby, whose young life was cut short so tragically. Loyalty, Lucia mused, is a strange and fragile thing. We pledge it to those we love, but it's so easily betrayed when faced with temptation or fear. Hammond betrayed his wife by preying on his niece, abusing the trust and love of both. Abby betrayed the aunt who raised her like a mother, trading that love for money and a phantom promise of freedom. And Sheila, in one uncontrollable moment, betrayed herself, betraying the principles she had lived by her whole life, by giving in to rage and doing something she could never forgive herself for. The price of betrayal for the Dixon family was exorbitant. Lives ruined, imprisonment, and death. The lesson wasn't just about the danger of secrets, but about the power of truth and forgiveness. If they had chosen to confront the truth, however painful, instead of cloaking it in lies, perhaps the tragedy could have been averted. Because in the end, the deadliest weapon wasn't the knife in the kitchen, but the lies that were kept for too long, corroding trust and turning love into hate. Lucia hugged her son tightly when he ran up to her, grateful for these simple joys, and promised herself she would always live honestly with those she loved. It was the only thing that could keep the darkness at bay.